The engine coughed twice and gave up with a wheeze that sounded like my bank account, empty, pitiful, and beyond repair. I sat there gripping the wheel for a minute longer than I should have, staring at the hulking shape that was apparently going to be my workplace, maybe even my home, for the next stretch of my life. The cabin at the far end of town didn't look like any cabin I'd ever seen. It was too big, too deliberate, with beams the size of tree trunks and windows that stretched higher than they needed to, as though whoever built it had been planning for tenants just a little larger than people. I hauled my duffel out of the back seat, the mountain air cold enough to sting my nose, and just as I shut the trunk, the front door opened with uncanny timing, like the place itself had been waiting. A man stepped out, crisp shirt tucked into slacks, shoes that had never tasted dirt, hair that looked like it could cut glass. Vale, my new boss. "Davis," he said, extending a hand that felt more like a test than a greeting, and when I squeezed back, his grip told me I'd already been measured. He smiled with his mouth, not his eyes. "Welcome. Call me Vale." I followed him inside, and the first thing that struck me was how the scale of everything seemed wrong. The hallway swallowed the light bulbs in its ceiling. The doorways were wide enough to push a refrigerator through without touching the sides, and the shadows gathered like they had weight. He kept up steady chatter, kitchen stocked, pantry loaded with cans, power systems automated, but he guided me carefully past certain doors, his shoulder subtly blocking mine when I tried to peek. Upstairs, he showed me my room, a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window that faced the endless trees. The bars welded over the glass had a decorative curl to them, like someone had tried to soften the truth, but they were bars all the same. "Previous worker left some clothes in the closet," Vale said, opening the door to show a few shirts still on hangers, one jacket folded neatly on the shelf. "Use what fits." I asked what happened to the last worker, but his voice closed like a trap. "Found something better." No more words on the subject. Back downstairs, the fireplace loomed massive, a thing designed to roast an animal whole, and Vale placed a thick envelope on the table between us. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind you associate with legal summons or last wills. Operational guidelines, house rules. Read them tonight, memorize by tomorrow. I slid the envelope toward me and felt its weight like a stone. "How many rules are we talking?" I asked. He gave a smile that didn't linger. "Enough." We drove into town for supplies in his truck, a winding road designed to tangle the memory. Every curve erased the last until I couldn't have pointed back if I wanted. He gripped the wheel like it was the only solid thing in the world and spoke over the hum of the tires. "First rule, and listen close, never bring anyone from town back to the cabin, not for dinner, not for help, not for anything." I waited for the explanation that didn't come. "Why not?" I asked. His jaw tightened. "They don't mix with the work environment." He took a corner sharp enough that the tires squealed. "Second rule, never give them alcohol. They don't handle it well. Third, if anyone asks you for help, no matter what, you refuse. No rides, no calls, no favors." "That's harsh," I said, watching the trees bend with the road. "It's survival," he answered, his knuckles gone white. I should have asked him to turn around right then, to bring me back to my broken car so I could cut my losses and figure out a different path. But I had $200 left to my name, no prospects and no safety net. Sometimes you don't get to choose between good and bad. Sometimes it's only bad or worse. By the time the town appeared, a single street lined with buildings that looked more like a set than a community, I'd already made my choice without realizing it. Eyes watched us from windows, subtle as curtains twitching, but the sense of being measured pressed against my skin. Vale pointed out the clinic, the bar, the store, naming people who already knew me better than I knew them. He spoke about the company in vague terms, research, environmental studies, things that didn't match the watchfulness in the locals' eyes. I met Mara, the nurse, her smile warm but her eyes unsettled. I saw Finch behind his tinted windows, the bar dim even in daylight, his broad shoulders shifting behind the counter. Then we drove back toward the cabin, the road winding so tightly it felt like we were circling something instead of traveling to it. By the time the massive timber frame rose from the tree line again, the envelope of rules felt heavier in my pocket, like it knew what was waiting inside. That night, alone in my room with the bars across the window, I finally tore the seal and began to read. The first rule made my stomach clench. Doors locked from sunset to sunrise, no exceptions. The second, do not respond to knocking, calling, or sounds from outside during night hours. The third, basement access is restricted. The fourth, second floor east wing is off limits. Room 7 stays locked. The rules went on, page after page of paranoia disguised as procedure. Rule 18 froze me in place. If townspeople appear injured or in distress during night hours, do not provide assistance. Contact morning supervisor immediately. I sat back, the papers trembling slightly in my hands. I'd wanted isolation, a clean break, a chance to rebuild. Instead, I'd walked into a place where rules weren't suggestions but lifelines, and breaking them wasn't an option. I pulled down the heavy curtains Vale had shown me, fabric so thick it turned the kitchen into a cave, and in the silence that followed I felt buried alive. Somewhere outside the wind pushed through the trees, and it sounded like whispering.
Morning came reluctantly, pale light bleeding through the heavy curtains like it had to fight its way inside, and I woke with the taste of metal in my mouth and the faint impression that the cabin had spent the night breathing while I slept. Vale was already in the kitchen, pouring coffee that smelled too bitter to be anything but instant, and he asked how I slept with a grin that told me he already knew the answer. I muttered something about the silence, how it felt loud, and he chuckled without humor. "You'll get used to it," he said. But his eyes stayed fixed on my face like he was gauging whether the first night had already cracked me. After breakfast, he insisted we drive into town, the long, winding road repeating its tricks, turning me around until I couldn't have pointed back to the cabin with a compass. The town itself looked the way abandoned film sets look after too many winters. Faded facades, old cars squatting in the same parking spots, streets swept too clean as if nature had been warned not to intrude. People watched as we passed, not hiding it but not welcoming either. Vale introduced me to Mara at the clinic, a nurse with auburn hair who smiled politely but never let her eyes linger on mine for long. Her hands, pale and careful, adjusted the paperwork on her counter in ways that made me think she needed to keep them busy or they'd shake. Finch at the bar was a wall of muscle, with hair gone gray at the edges and a smile that was more warning than welcome. "How's the cabin treating you?" he asked, polishing a glass that never seemed to get clean. I told him it was quiet. "Good," he said. "Quiet's what you want." His regulars looked up from their drinks in unison, tracking me like cats tracking a fly, eyes too sharp, too reflective in the dim. When we left, I ducked into the general store to grab bottled water, and that's when Rowan approached me. She was young, maybe mid-20s, thin as a wire, her eyes darting to the windows like she was checking whether anyone was watching. "You're working at the cabin," she said in a whisper so low I almost didn't catch it. "Don't be brave after dark." Her hand brushed mine as she pressed change into my palm, and I felt the ridged texture of old scars along her wrist. Vale appeared like smoke, smiling his politician's smile, steering me out the door with a grip on my arm that said, "Stop asking questions." On the drive back, he talked about how the town had its quirks, how the people were particular, how small communities bred strange traditions. I nodded, but all I could think about was Rowan's words echoing in my head. "Don't be brave." That night, alone again, I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope spread in front of me, rules underlined and circled like scripture. Rule 6, do not shine lights toward the tree line. Rule 11, radio silence after 2200 unless Protocol B. Rule 17, no food, water, or medical aid to non-staff after sundown. Rule 23, previous employee effects remain in storage until release authorization. Each one was more forbidding than the last, a checklist not of operations but of survival. I toured the cabin with my flashlight, careful to keep the beam low, and found the storage closet veiled past earlier. The padlock was new, the metal still bright against the wood, and through the slats I saw boxes stacked with names scrawled in marker, a laptop bag, clothes still hanging on a rod as though their owners had just stepped away for a moment and never returned. A draft carried the faint smell of antiseptic up from the floorboards, a sterile tang that didn't belong in a place made of wood and stone. I logged everything in the battered notebook Vale had told me to keep, copying the last entry from whoever came before me. Day 34, scrawled in cramped handwriting. Don't let the voices pick the door. The line made my skin crawl because it wasn't phrased as advice, it read like a confession. Before sunset, I pulled the blackout curtains across every window, locked every bolt and checked the hinges twice, my heart pounding like I was sealing myself in a tomb. Outside, the world went dark with the speed of a falling curtain, and the cabin seemed to exhale around me. I sat at the monitors, waiting for the night to show me what it wanted. Rowan's warning heavy in my mind, the rules burning like scripture I didn't dare break. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the forest was already awake, and it was only a matter of time before it came knocking.
The second night began the way the first ended, with me sitting at the monitoring desk, the logbook open to a blank page, the camera showing nothing but trees shifting under the weight of the wind, and the cabin creaking like it was settling deeper into the ground. But the longer I listened, the more I realized the silence wasn't silence at all. It was layered with faint sounds I couldn't place, like whispers just at the edge of hearing, or the scuff of something dragging across wood. At 12:11 a.m., the first knock came, soft and deliberate. 3 taps on the front door that echoed through the hall like they were meant for me alone. I froze, staring at the monitor trained on the porch, and there she was. Mara, the nurse from the clinic, auburn hair catching the porch light, her white uniform torn across the shoulder and smeared with what could only be blood. She leaned on the railing like she could barely stand and called out in a voice that trembled with pain, "Please, I need help. I crashed my car. I'm bleeding badly." My hand moved automatically to the deadbolt control, every decent instinct in me screaming to open the door, but Rule 2 drilled itself into my skull. Do not respond to knocking, calling, or sounds from outside during night hours. I told myself it was a test, some kind of conditioning trick, but when she pressed her face against the window and I saw the streak of red trailing down her cheek, it was almost impossible to believe this was anything but real. "Just let me call someone," she begged, her voice breaking in the exact way I'd heard desperate people break before, a sound too human to fake, except when her eyes lifted to the camera. They caught the infrared and reflected back like an animal's, glowing faintly, unnatural. She smiled then, a slow unfurling of teeth that looked sharper than I remembered, and in a deeper voice that carried a mechanical undertone, she said, "Good, Davis. You can read." My stomach lurched as she stepped back from the door and began circling the cabin, her movements shifting from staggering to precise, almost predatory, as she peered through each window one by one, topping the glass with nails that glinted too sharp in the porch light. For nearly an hour she circled, like a shark, sometimes disappearing from the cameras only to reappear at another side, sometimes standing motionless with her face inches from the glass, her smile patient, her breath fogging the pain. Once she spoke in Mara's voice again, weak and trembling, and said, "You remind me of my brother. You wouldn't let me die out here, would you?" But then her voice dropped into something guttural, layered, wrong. "The last one lasted 3 months, Davis. He followed the rules too. But everybody breaks." I gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles hurt, forcing myself to remember the handwriting in the logbook, the desperate note, "Don't let the voices pick the door." At 2 a.m., she vanished from the cameras entirely, and I thought maybe it was over until the floor beneath me vibrated with the faint sound of scratching, a metallic scrape against steel that came from the direction of the basement. I stood in the hall staring at the locked keypad door, heart hammering, when I heard it, my own voice, clear as day, speaking from the other side. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Davis," it said in my tone with my nervous pause, perfect down to the cadence. I stumbled back up the stairs, every hair on my arms rising, and forced myself into the monitoring chair, where I sat rigid until the sun crept over the treetops and light poured through the cracks in the curtains. When the radio crackled at 7 a.m. with Vale's voice asking how my night had gone, I almost told him the truth, almost confessed that I'd heard Mara's voice, my own voice, and scratching from behind the locked door, but instead I just wrote in the logbook, Day 2, voices and mimicry, no breaches, because something told me that whatever game I'd stepped into, the only thing keeping me alive was pretending I still believed the rules were enough.
Morning light spilled into the cabin like it was reluctant to cross the threshold, and I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee that tasted more like rust than caffeine, staring at the rules spread out in front of me as though repetition could carve them into my bones. I barely noticed when Vale walked in carrying a grocery bag in each hand, his shirt pressed like he'd just stepped out of an office instead of a mountain road, and he asked with that rehearsed brightness if my second night had been uneventful. I told him there had been knocking, voices, something scratching at the basement door, and his smile thinned into something taut, a stretched rubber band about to snap. "Good," he said. "You remembered the rules. That's the point. Most don't." I wanted to press, to ask him who exactly most referred to. But he was already unpacking cans of soup and water filters, moving with the efficiency of a man who'd repeated this ritual hundreds of times. When he carried a box down the hall, I followed, watching as he stopped outside the padlocked storage closet and fumbled with a key I hadn't seen him use before. The door creaked open to reveal shelves stacked with boxes, clothes hanging on rods, a laptop bag shoved into a corner like someone had dropped it there mid-escape. Each box had a name scrawled in marker. Marcus, Feb to May. Sarah, Aug to October. Rodriguez, March to April. I stared, feeling my throat dry up. "They just left?" I asked. Vale's voice was steady but colder than the padlock he reclasped. "They made mistakes." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push, because his body language told me the conversation was closed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that every box was a coffin, a reminder that people didn't quit this job, they were erased by it. That afternoon, desperate for something resembling normal, I drove myself into town. The road twisted in ways that made my stomach turn, and I realized halfway through that the cabin's isolation wasn't just physical, it was designed. Roads meant to confuse, to erase bearings, to make escape improbable. The bar was dim and smelled like wet wood, Finch standing behind the counter like a statue carved from oak, and when I ordered a beer, he didn't ask what kind, just slid me a bottle that tasted stale, but wet enough to swallow. "How's the cabin?" he asked, polishing the bar with a rag that looked older than me. "Quiet," I said. His grin was thin. "Quiet's a good start. The ones who complain about silence don't last." The patrons at the bar didn't turn their heads, but their eyes followed me in the mirror, movements too precise, like puppets pretending to be drunk. I left quickly, but not before Finch said softly, "Don't go answering voices, Davis. Not unless you want to meet the rest of us." At the general store, Rowan was behind the counter, her smile too quick, too practiced. And when I paid for bottled water, she leaned close enough that I could see faint ridges running along her neck like scars that hadn't healed properly. "They'll use your father's voice, or your mother's, whatever you ache for most. Don't listen." I froze with the change in my hand, staring. But before I could answer, the bell over the door jingled and Vale appeared in the doorway, smiling like a pastor on Sunday service. Rowan snapped upright, her face flattening into the neutral politeness of a cashier who didn't want trouble, and I realized she was terrified. On the drive back, Vale chatted about the community like it was some quaint club, talking about adaptation periods and integration timelines, phrases that slid off his tongue too smoothly, too rehearsed, like corporate jargon that hid blood under paperwork. By the time we pulled up to the cabin again, my hands were shaking so badly on the steering wheel I thought I might drop the keys. But I forced myself to nod, to smile faintly, to pretend his talk of integration didn't make my stomach clench. That night, when the sun dipped behind the tree line, I locked every bolt twice, drew the blackout curtains until no light leaked, and checked the basement keypad like a man checking the bars of a cage from the inside. I sat at the monitors, the logbook open to a fresh page, and wrote in neat, careful letters, Day 3, voices expected, integrity intact, following rules.
But under it, in smaller writing I didn't even want to admit was mine, I added, "Storage closet, full of ghosts."
By the third night, I thought I knew what to expect. Knocks, voices, shadows at the windows. But what came was worse because it was personal. So precise, it felt like someone had been rifling through my memories. It began just after midnight with a gentle rapping on the porch door, followed by a voice I hadn't heard in years, my father's, carrying the same dry rasp he'd had the day before he died. The same way he said my name when he wanted me to listen. "Davis, open up, son. Let me in." And I felt my throat close because for one impossible second, I wanted to believe it was him, that he had somehow found his way here to pull me out of this nightmare. But the monitor showed only shadows pressed against the door. No figure, no outline, just sound. Then from the east wall came another voice, softer, a woman's, my ex-wife Ellen, who I hadn't spoken to since the divorce papers were signed. Her voice trembling the way it had during our last argument when she said she couldn't watch me drown in my obsessions anymore. "Please, Davis, I need to talk. I was wrong. I miss you." And it was so perfect, so painfully accurate that I nearly reached for the curtains before Rule 2 slammed through my head like a nail. Do not respond to knocking, calling, or any sounds from outside during night hours. I gritted my teeth and stayed at the desk. But then came a laugh from behind the laundry room, deep and familiar. My younger brother's, though he'd been gone from my life for almost a decade, and he said, "Remember when we sank Dodd's canoe and blamed the wind?" And I physically recoiled because no one outside this cabin should know that memory. No logbook or file could have recorded something that small, that private. My hands shook as I wrote in the log. Day 3. Voices escalated, mimicking family, precision disturbingly accurate. But even as I put the pen down, the floor beneath my boots vibrated with a new sound, a metallic scraping that seemed to come from the basement, claws reeking against steel, deliberate and steady, like something testing its cage. I stood in the hall staring at the keypad door, my breath fogging in the dim light. And then, clear as if I were listening to a recording, I heard my own voice from the other side whisper, "Don't fight it, Davis. It's you. We're you." And the sheer impossibility of it made my legs weak because it wasn't just the sound of me, it had the rhythm of my speech, the nervous hitch I get when I'm lying, the exact cadence I recognized in myself when I'm scared. And hearing that from the basement felt like the building itself was trying to clone me. I backed away, climbed the stairs 2 at a time, and forced myself back into the monitoring chair. But the voices didn't stop. They rotated, one after another, my father begging, Ellen apologizing, my brother laughing, sometimes overlapping, weaving a chorus that tugged at every vulnerable part of me. The cabin alive with ghosts that weren't ghosts. I clamped my hands over my ears and stared at the monitors, repeating Vale's rules in my head like scripture. But when the porch camera flickered, I saw a figure finally appear. Tall, still, standing in the wash of the porch light, pressing a hand against the glass. I zoomed the camera and saw the palm was wrong. The lines etched too deep. The pads of the fingers scored like someone had taken a knife to them to exaggerate texture. Not human at all. More like a costume glove stretched over bone. My stomach turned cold, but I didn't move, didn't breathe, until the figure melted back into the tree line. At dawn, the cabin quieted as if nothing had happened. The voices gone, the air still. But when I pulled back the curtain in the kitchen, I saw the faint smear of that handprint still on the glass, chalky white and ridged in a way no handprint should be. I spent the morning scrubbing it until my fingers hurt, but the ridges lingered like scars in the glass. And when Vale returned at noon and asked how I'd slept, I said, quiet, because the truth felt like something he already knew. That afternoon, I drove into town alone, needing answers, and at the general store, Rowan caught me between shelves, her voice tight as a wire as she whispered, "They'll start with kindness, then grief, then guilt. Don't listen, Davis. That's how they open the door." She glanced toward the window, and I noticed her hands trembling, her knuckles white around a box of nails. And for the first time, I realized she wasn't warning me out of pity. She was warning me because she had lived through it.
By the 4th night, I stopped pretending I was calm, because the cabin had already started teaching me its language. Every groan in the rafters, every vibration through the floorboards, every change in the pitch of the ventilation system carried a meaning I didn't want to learn,
but I learned it anyway, because that's what survival felt like. I sat at the monitoring desk with the logbook open, pen hovering, waiting for the inevitable. And sure enough, just after 1 in the morning, the monitors glitched. Not a total blackout, but a shudder that made the images smear across the screen like wet paint. And when they cleared, I saw someone crossing the porch, tall and deliberate, their movements so fluid they looked rehearsed. My stomach clenched when I realized it was me. My own shape, my own face, captured in the grainy night vision, walking slowly to the front door and placing a hand against the glass. I froze, my eyes darting between the camera feed and the door itself, terrified I'd see the outline of my own body standing there in real time. But the glass stayed empty while the monitor showed me leaning closer, my voice leaking through the speakers with chilling precision. "You're tired, Davis. Open up, come outside, let's talk." I wanted to scream, but I wrote instead, scrawling in the logbook. Day 4, subject replication attempted, visual and auditory mimic confirmed. The scratching in the basement came next, sharper this time, claws raking in a rhythm, 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Morse code for SOS, except it was my own voice speaking from behind the steel door, whispering my name over and over until it broke into a desperate laugh. I shoved my chair back, pressed my palms to my ears, but the vibration carried through my bones, and when I risked a glance at the monitors, the figure that looked like me had moved to the kitchen window, lips moving silently as if whispering secrets. I forced myself to breathe, to repeat the rules like a prayer, and then I noticed something new. The air smelled faintly chemical, shark, antiseptic, drifting from the vents. My hands shook as I climbed onto the counter, pried open the return grate and jammed charcoal filters into the duct until the hiss stalled, convinced the cabin was dosing me with something to soften resistance. At 3 in the morning, the figure on the monitors was gone, but the voices came back. Not my family this time, but Rowan, her voice trembling, begging me to let her in, whispering things she could only know if she'd lived inside my head. "Davis, remember the scar on your hand from the canoe? You told me about it. I know you did. I can help you." And I wanted to believe her, wanted to believe she was out there risking herself to warn me, but then the camera showed the outline of something crouched low in the tree line, too long-limbed, too wrong-shaped, speaking with her voice, and I shut the curtains so hard the rod cracked. Dawn came like mercy, pale light spilling across the monitors until the forest looked like a place again, instead of a wall of waiting teeth. And when the radio crackled with Vale's voice asking how I'd fared, I nearly told him the truth. But I caught myself. Because the logbook entries, the padlocked closet, Rowan's warnings all told me the same thing. The test wasn't about surviving the night. It was about convincing them I was adapting. And if I showed doubt, I'd join the names written on those boxes. So I said, steady as I could manage, "Quiet night, system stable," while staring at the faint chalky handprint still etched into the kitchen glass. After breakfast, Vale asked if I wanted to walk the property to learn the generators and filtration system. And I agreed because saying no felt dangerous. And he talked about maintenance as though the cabin were alive, a thing that needed caretaking. And I realized he wasn't wrong. The place was alive, but not in the way houses should be. That afternoon, driving into town for more supplies, I saw Rowan again at the store. She leaned close, eyes darting, and whispered, "They'll try to make you believe you are already one of them, Davis. When you start seeing yourself outside, that's the beginning." I wanted to ask what the end looked like, but Vale stepped from an aisle with a box of canned beans, smiling his too perfect smile, and Rowan shut her mouth like a trap, her knuckles white on the counter. Back at the cabin, I locked the curtains tighter than ever and stared at the logbook, writing with deliberate strokes. Day 4. Subject aware of replication attempts. Rule compliance intact. Trust eroding. Then I added, smaller, in a corner I hoped no one would read, "If they can wear my face, how will I know when I'm the one knocking?" By the 5th night, exhaustion had carved itself into me like a second skeleton, and I felt half convinced that maybe that was the point, that the cabin wasn't meant to be endured, but to wear you down until the rules stopped feeling like rules and started feeling like instinct. And as I sat at the monitoring desk, staring at the blank logbook page, I realized my pen was trembling, not from fear, but from fatigue, the kind that makes your thoughts heavy and your judgment thinner than it should be. The voices didn't come right away, which was worse, because silence became expectation. Every creak in the walls, a countdown to something I couldn't stop. And when it finally came, it wasn't knocking or mimicry at first, but the faint sound of crying, soft, childlike, echoing from the east wing of the cabin, the one place Vale had told me never to go. And I froze with my pen hovering, listening as it grew louder, sobbing and hiccuping like a child left alone in the dark. My gut twisted. I don't like kids in pain, even when I know it's fake. And I found myself halfway down the hall before I caught sight of the brass 7 nailed to the last door, the one he'd specifically told me to keep locked. The crying stopped the second I reached it. Silence. Then, in a voice I hadn't heard since I was 6 years old, my mother's voice from decades ago, gentle and warm, I heard, "Davis, honey, open the door. It's okay. I'm here." My chest ached, my hand hovering over the knob, because it was her exactly, her cadence, her softness, even the little upward lilt she always had when she was trying to reassure me, and I wanted, more than anything, to believe it. But the rules screamed at me, screamed through my blood, "Do not enter room 7. I stumbled back, slammed the hall door shut, and leaned against it until my lungs burned. When I returned to the monitoring desk, the porch camera flickered to life, and there I was again, my face, my movements. Except this time, the mimic wasn't trying to convince me, it was angry. Pacing the porch like a caged animal, its mouth opening and closing in silent screams until the sound cut in over the radio instead. My own voice rasping. "You can't hide in here forever, Davis. We know what you miss. We'll give it back." The logbook blurred under my pen as I forced myself to write, Day 5, escalation. Interior mimicry attempted, room 7, active. At dawn, the silence that replaced it felt like pity, the cabin settling in around me like it was disappointed I hadn't broken yet. Vale returned mid-morning, immaculate as ever, carrying fresh groceries, and when I told him about the crying child in my mother's voice, he didn't blink. He just nodded, like I'd checked off a box on his invisible clipboard, and said, "They're escalating you quickly. That's good. It means you're adapting." He said it like praise, but all I heard was that I was sliding deeper into something I couldn't crawl out of. Later, when I asked what was in room 7, his smile faltered for the first time since I'd met him. "Don't worry about it," he said, his voice flat. "That's not for you." But I could tell by the twitch in his jaw that it was exactly for me, eventually. That afternoon, desperate for a break from the cabin's oppressive breath, I drove to town and Rowan was waiting at the counter like she'd been expecting me. Her eyes darted to the window, then back at me, and in a whisper so sharp it felt like it cut the air, she said, "When you hear the child, that means the cabin's almost done testing you. They'll move you to the next phase, soon." I asked her what the next phase was, and she shook her head so fast I thought she might hurt herself. "Don't let them. If you go down there, you won't come back." Before I could ask any more, Finch walked in, nodding politely, and Rowan clammed up instantly, shoving my receipt at me like I was any other customer. Driving back, I thought about how Vale smiled when I mentioned the crying, and how Rowan's face had gone pale when she said the next phase, and how every night the cabin seemed less like a building and more like a machine meant to process me into something else. That night, I sat at the monitors with the rules spread in front of me, whispering them to myself like a mantra, because I knew if I slipped, just once, they'd open the door for me, and whatever was waiting on the other side of room 7 would finally have me.
By the 6th night, the cabin felt less like a place I was working in and more like something I was strapped to, like the walls and floors had hands of their own wrapped around me, squeezing tighter each hour. And even though I kept repeating the rules like scripture, each word was starting to taste like ash in my mouth, because I was beginning to realize the rules weren't for keeping me safe. They were for keeping me contained, like livestock behind a fence. And that thought clawed at me as I sat in the monitoring chair staring at the empty forest feeds. The night began deceptively quiet, just wind moving the trees, but around 1:30 the porch camera picked up movement and my stomach dropped when I saw not a mimic, not a shadow, but Vale himself, standing there in his pressed shirt looking exactly as he had that morning when he'd left for town, except his eyes glowed faintly red in the infrared. And when he knocked on the door, it was deliberate, confident, like a man who already knew I'd open. "Davis, it's me," he called, his voice steady. "The truck broke down, let me in." And for a full 30 seconds, I almost did, because my mind screamed that it was him, that maybe this was the one real exception to Rule 2. But then the radio on the desk crackled to life and Vale's voice, calm, casual, came through.
All good here in town, Davis. Keep watch. Don't break protocol. I stared at the monitor, my hand hovering above the deadbolt control, caught between two veils, one outside in the flesh, the other on the airwaves, until the one at the door tilted his head in that too smooth, too fluid way I'd seen in the townspeople, and his smile spread too wide, showing canines that caught the porch light. I stumbled back, heart hammering, and wrote in the logbook with shaking hands. Day 6, Administrator Mimic attempted confirmation of duplicity. The fake veil circled the cabin for hours, pausing at windows, calling out details only the real veil should have known, like the number of shirts in the closet of my room or the scar on my left knuckle from a broken beer bottle years ago. And each time I nearly cracked, because how could they know those things unless Veil himself had told them, unless this whole thing was just layers of manipulation stacked until I couldn't tell where the truth ended. Around 3 a.m, the mimic shifted again, this time speaking with Rowan's voice, soft and pleading. "Davis, it's me. Please, they're hurting me. You have to let me in." And I swore I heard her sobs catch like they had in the store when she'd warned me to be careful. But then she said something that made my blood run cold. "You'll end up like Marcus if you don't help me." Marcus. The name I'd seen on one of the boxes in the storage closet, the name scrawled in frantic handwriting in the logbook. My stomach dropped because that wasn't just mimicry anymore. That was information I wasn't supposed to have, proof they were aware of what I'd seen, what I knew. At dawn, the mimic vanished, leaving the cabin soaked in silence that felt heavier than any noise. And when Vale returned at noon, carrying groceries and whistling like nothing had happened, I could barely look at him without wondering if he was real at all. He studied me while unpacking cans, eyes sharp, searching, and said casually, "They'll use what you most want to believe against you. The question is, do you know what that is yet?" I nodded, but inside my mind spun, because I was no longer sure who they were. The townspeople, the voices, or Vale himself. Later that afternoon, needing some kind of anchor to reality, I drove into town again, and Rowan cornered me in the store, her face pale, her voice shaking. "They're accelerating you, Davis. That means you're close to either breaking or integrating. Don't let them choose for you." Before I could respond, Mara walked in, crisp uniform, smiling, but her eyes locked onto Rowan with a glare sharp enough to slice air, and Rowan shut up instantly, her knuckles whitening against the counter. I walked out with supplies I didn't need, my pulse still racing, and by the time I reached the cabin again, I knew one thing for certain. The rules weren't to protect me from them, they were to protect them from me, or maybe to protect the program from both of us. And every night I obeyed was one night closer to becoming part of the collection behind that padlocked closet.
By the 7th night, I felt like I was already splitting into two people. The Davis who sat at the monitors with his pen steady, writing neat log entries that proved he was following the rules, and the Davis whose hands shook every time the cabin breathed too loudly, who wanted to drive until the mountains disappeared in the rearview mirror, even if it meant starving to death in some ditch. And that fracture deepened when the alarms began. Not the soft electronic chirps I'd heard before, but a full-throated shriek from somewhere below, a mechanical scream that rattled the mugs in the kitchen cabinet. On the monitors, every camera flickered red with the same warning: containment breach, lockdown protocol. The porch door bolted automatically, the vents shuttered, and the hall lights snapped into a dim crimson glow like the cabin had been waiting to reveal its true color. Then the front door opened. Not delicately, not in mimicry, but wide and certain like someone owned the place. And in walked Mara and Finch, not as predators circling me like they had before, but as people, breathless and urgent, their movements stripped of the theatrical fluidity. "Davis, we don't have much time," Mara said, her voice tight, real, not filtered through a modulation device. "The lockdown vents gas to the entire building in 15 minutes. We either die or we make it matter." Finch shoved a keycard into my hand, his eyes burning with conviction. "The control room is below the lab. During emergency lockdown, all research data uploads automatically to the network. We can reroute it to agencies, investigators, anyone who'll pay attention." I wanted to argue, wanted to demand why I should trust them after nights of torment, but the building itself answered for me. A hiss rising through the floor as the first tendrils of chemical stink leaked into the air, burning my throat. We moved fast, down the hall, past the storage closet whose padlock I now knew was less a lock and more a tombstone, into the stairwell that led below, the red emergency lights strobing across the concrete like blood pumping through veins. The lab didn't look like part of the cabin at all. It was all steel and glass, humming machines and surgical rigs, medical chairs with restraints worn by use, monitors filled with files of faces, some I recognized from town, others I didn't. I tried not to look too closely at the surgical trays, scalpels, clamps, syringes full of thick, dark fluid, and focused on the key card Finch used to slide open the control room door. Inside, banks of servers glowed like a false dawn, screens filled with progress bars. One read, Data Mirror, 72% uploaded. Another, Full Facility Purge, 11:58 minutes remaining. Mara sat down at the terminal, her hands flying over keys, rerouting the data with the efficiency of someone who'd done this in secret a dozen times before, while Finch braced the door with a crowbar jammed into the hinges. I hovered, feeling useless, until the screen on my left lit up with security feeds from other facilities, Nevada, Maine, Oregon, dozens of cabins like ours, each with their own Davis, their own logbooks, their own padlocked closets. My blood iced. This isn't one lodge, I whispered, my throat tight. This is a network. Mara didn't look up, her voice flat. It's bigger than you think. That's why we need this data out. At 9 minutes, the air in the room changed, heavier, chemical burning sharper, and my head buzzed like bees. It's starting, Finch growled, sweat streaking his temple, his muscles straining to hold the crowbar against the door. Faster, Mara! She cursed under her breath, fingers racing, and then the screen flashed. Redirect initiated. FBI, CDC Oversight Committee. A new bar filled, 90%, 95%. At 97%, the servers hiccuped, lights flickering, and suddenly Vale's voice filled the room over the intercom, calm, clinical, everywhere at once. You're making a mistake, Davis. They're feeding you rebellion like it's freedom. But you'll find out soon enough, survival has its own price. My heart slammed in my chest. He was watching, listening, waiting. The bar inched up, 99%, 100%. Then the whole system shuddered, and a new warning screamed, Purge imminent, 3 minutes remaining. It's done, Mara shouted, ripping a portable drive from the terminal. The data's out. Now we run. Finch yanked the crowbar free as the first hiss of poison gas slipped under the door, white tendrils curling like fingers. We bolted, sprinting through the lab, past the empty chairs, the glass tanks, the red-lit hallways that seemed longer than before. My lungs screamed, my head swam, but I kept running, because this was it. If the rules had ever mattered, this was the one they hadn't written down. Don't die here. Not like this. We burst into the stairwell as alarms wailed, the gas rolling up behind us like a tide, and as we pounded up the concrete steps, I realized this was the first night I hadn't written a single word in the logbook. Because tonight, there was no entry to make, only the choice to get out alive or let the cabin erase me like all the rest.
We hit the surface just as the cabin gave its death rattle, a roar from deep below shaking the timbers so hard dust rained down from the rafters, and I stumbled into the kitchen gasping clean air like it was salvation, Mara shoving me toward a side hall I hadn't known existed, Finch slamming open a service door that led out into the pre-dawn woods. The three of us sprinted across the frozen ground, the smell of chemicals chasing us like a phantom, and behind us, the cabin exhaled one final groan before the underground facility ignited, a bloom of fire tearing through the trees, heat licking our backs as we dove behind the truck Finch had stashed beneath camouflage netting. The blast cracked the sky, a thunderclap rolling down the valley, and I knew that whatever secrets hadn't been uploaded were now ash. But the drive in Mara's hands pulsed like a heartbeat, proof of what had been done, of all the faces and names locked in boxes and closets across the country. Finch drove like the devil himself was after us, wheels spinning gravel as the flames shrank in the rear view, and I sat in the back seat shaking, watching the orange glow fade while my own reflection in the window stared back with eyes I didn't trust anymore. My vision felt sharper than it should, my muscles tighter, my wounds from the scramble healing too quickly. And Mara's earlier words echoed in my skull, "You're already changing, Davis, whether you want to or not."
We hit the highway just as the sun cracked the horizon, the world outside blissfully unaware that one of its monsters had just burned, and for the first time in days I felt the smallest sliver of hope, though it was jagged and bitter, because Vale's voice still lingered in my ears, calm and unshakable, promising survival at any cost. Mara turned in her seat, face pale but eyes burning. "We can't stop, not now. The network's bigger than this one place. They'll come looking." Finch grunted, hands steady on the wheel. "They always do." I thought of Rowan back in town, her scars, her warnings, and wondered if she'd already been swallowed, if she was still alive at all. I thought of Marcus, of the names on those boxes, of their logbooks cut off mid-entry, and I felt rage blooming in my chest hotter than the fire we'd left behind. I was supposed to be a caretaker, a night watchman, someone to follow rules and keep systems steady, but they'd picked the wrong man for obedience. They'd picked a man who once dug too deep, lost his life for it, and still hadn't learned how to stop. I clenched my fists and felt the strength in them. Unnatural. Humming. Not earned. And for the first time, I wasn't just afraid of what the cabin had done to me. I was tempted by it. What if Vale was right? What if this was survival? The road stretched ahead, endless, and Mara pressed the drive into my hands, heavy as a weapon. "You kept records, didn't you?" she asked. "You wrote everything down. That makes you valuable." Her words cut deeper than she knew, because she was right. I had documented every whisper, every mimic, every rule. Journalism was dead for me, but evidence, that I still knew how to preserve. I nodded, gripping the drive so tight my knuckles popped. "Then we keep going," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "We take this to anyone who will listen, and if they won't listen, we make them." Finch glanced at me in the mirror, his eyes hard but approving, and Mara leaned back against the seat, closing her eyes like she'd finally found someone else to carry part of the weight. Behind us, the cabin still burned, smoke curling above the trees like a funeral pyre. And I thought about the rules one last time, the ones that had been drilled into me until they felt holy. Keep the doors locked. Don't answer voices. Don't shine lights at the tree line. Don't help the townspeople. Don't disturb the belongings. Don't question. But I had broken all of them in my head, every single one, and I was still alive. Maybe that was the only real rule: survive and figure out the rest later. As the miles rolled beneath the tires, I opened the logbook to a blank page and scrolled in thick, uneven letters. Day 7. Cabin destroyed. Data secured. Survivors on the run. Rules irrelevant. The fight continues. And for the first time since I'd arrived at the far end of town, I didn't feel like prey anymore. I felt like the hunt had only just begun. So that's the end of Davis's story. Or maybe just the beginning. The cabin at the far end of town burned, but the network behind it is still out there, waiting for the next name on their list. If you enjoyed tonight's tale, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us here on Echoes After Midnight. We have new terrifying stories every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Until then, keep your doors locked, and whatever you do, don't answer the voices in the dark.